then to the final topic, which is the probability of God's existence. So again, to remind ourselves, what he's saying is that there is no reason to regard God as immune from consideration along the spectrum of probabilities. And my view is that yes, there's a very good reason to literally to think that God's existence is immune from considerations along the spectrum of probabilities, and there's a good reason for this. So I understand Dawkins' point, because probability is one of those things, and I believe Dawkins is not a probabilist, so I don't think he knows the theory of probability that well. And when you don't, it's easy to fall to this trap, and many people do, because probability is something that most people have a very good sort of gut feeling about it. We know how six-sided die works. We know roughly what's the probability of certain poker hands and so on. We have an idea, tossing coin and such. But the thing is, these are very sort of gut feeling based. Most people actually don't know how to rigorously construct these kind of mathematical probabilities. And when you do it rigorously, it involves constructing something known as a probability space. And that means you need to construct very carefully the possible outcomes of your random event or random experiment. And then from those outcomes, you need to construct very carefully possible events that can happen. And then for those events, you need to very carefully assign probabilities. And this assignment of these probabilities is not something you just go throwing around numbers based on your gut feeling, but you have to do it very carefully. And that part is basically modeling the real physical world. A simple example of this is, for example, the six-sided die. The possible outcomes is from the numbers from 1 to 6, and the probabilistic model for that would be saying that each of the outcomes is equally likely, and that's from those that basically in its simplicity constitutes the probability space, and we can do the calculations. But now when it comes to these more subtle things such as existence of God, the big issue, which I think very much warrants to say that the existence of God is immune to considerations of probability, is that the probabilistic model that we construct is always a model for our physical universe. That is the best we can do. And in Christianity, although I'm not a theologian, I believe I'm not misrepresenting Christianity, but in Christianity, God is considered to be transcendent. It's outside the universe. The universe is the creation. God is outside the creation. Of course, it can intervene and somehow get inside the creation, but it's also transcendent. And here is the big theoretical issue which makes these considerations quite immune to probabilities, is that the probabilistic models are based on physical universe, and therefore we have no reason whatsoever to assume that they somehow apply to things outside the universe, our physical universe. And that just means that literally means that God is immune to the considerations of probabilities. Now, I do know, of course, that there are some, let's say, Christian apologists who make these calculations and make arguments based on probabilities. And I would say that, again, I personally take that sort of arguments with very, very high level of skepticism. I don't think they are particularly strong arguments for this reason specifically. And one of the methods they use is the so-called Bayesian method, which brings us to the next topic, which is well, it's still the probability of God's existence, but what Dawkins says there, assigning the probability 50%, because we don't know. And again, I would say, and he even emphasizes that there is certainly no reason to suppose that it would be 50%. But I actually would say, yes, there is. And in fact, and these 50% is in connection with what I said about the Bayesian inference. These would be typically considered the prior probabilities, which means that what do we consider to be the probability of God's existence before we observe any information, any data. and then the Bayesian inference is basically gathering data and using that to correct your prior beliefs about the thing. That's how, roughly speaking, Bayesian inference works. And now, the reason why I'm saying that this 50%, this 50-50 division for existence and non-existence is actually pretty much the only probabilistic thing that I can sort of accept. The only probability that I can accept to be assigned to the existence of God, for the reason that mathematically speaking, this 50-50 is the rigorous way of expressing that we don't know. We simply don't know. That there is no information. It could be either. That's the mathematically rigorous way. Now, but if you go anywhere from that, sort of when talking about the existence of God, it gets quite problematic for the reason I just explained. That these probabilities that you just start adjusting are based on models of the physical universe, and there's no reason to say that they somehow apply to the transcendent. Now, you might say that am I not contradicting myself, because surely then the 50% as well is based on this world. And in a way, yes, and I do think that this, here we are getting a bit kind of a murky territory, which I'm not entirely sure, but I would say that for that 50-50, we can still kind of find an argument to use that, because we could say that it's more like a more probabilistic model for a person who claims that God exists. We could say it is 50-50 that this person is right, and that could be said to be based on simply that if this guy just randomly takes a guess out of 2, the chances are that in half of the cases he'll be right. So again, the model would be actually based on this physical world rather than the transcendent. But there are a few subtleties here, and altogether what I would say is that I think this is the final strike for Dawkins on this matter. And the issue why I wanted to talk about this, although my personal view of this matter is that I'm not a huge fan of these probability-based arguments for the existence of God or the non-existence of God. Either way, I don't think they are particularly strong for the reasons I've explained. However, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that I think, again, Dawkins makes a big blunder here because he takes a very, very sort of common sense, gut feeling based view of probabilities, which is a very respectable discipline within mathematics, and therefore it's really again a very big disservice to the scientific world to have as a spokesperson for these kind of things a person like Dawkins, in my opinion, and that's why I wanted to raise this issue. But yeah, I just as a conclusion regarding the probabilities, I'm not a huge fan of these probabilistic arguments altogether, one way or the other. So I know it's been a long video, and just quickly to sum up, 3 things. You absolutely can't prove a negative. There is no unbreakable logical rule that prevents you from doing that. The second thing, burden of proof rests with whoever makes a claim. That's how it works. There is no fundamental rule that says that only Christians need to make prove their case. Atheists just the same. And if you claim to be an agnostic and at the same time make the claim that God doesn't exist, you're just, in my opinion, not making sense. And the third one, because the transcendent nature of God, and because of the inherent reliance of probability assignments on the modeling of physical universe, that just makes probability and the existence or anything related to God completely incompatible. You can't really apply probabilities, or only it at the most restricted sense you can think of. All right. God bless you all.